too long.
Well, hello there. Welcome to another episode of Reading with my teacher. You might notice that we are sitting close to the out of doors, something known as nature. Occasionally there will be things flying by the window in the background. They're called birds. If you went outside once in a while, maybe put your cell phone down, you might see one. They come in a lot of different sizes. Out here in the country, we have lots of them. Some are small, some are blue and red, and some are really big, and they eat dead stuff. They're really huge. They're called buzzards. Anyhow, today, more importantly, we are going to focus on reading and learning about the events that lead up to the Civil War, the United States Civil War. We'll be reading from our book, The Americans, this one right here. Yeah. And we will be on page 304. At the top of that page, it has a little heading called The Divisive Politics of Slavery. And at this time, there was a lot of argument and fighting amongst the members of Congress and presidents, for that matter, over the issue of slavery and whether each new state should have slavery or not have it. This isn't a whole lot different than what we've seen up until recently with the so-called fiscal cliff, where our senators have been and our representatives have been fighting about how to resolve that issue. Okay, well, I'm going to start reading with a One American story that tells us the viewpoint of a fellow named John C. Calhoun. We were talking about him before the Christmas break. He's still around in history. He's been involved with a lot of things, and there's a really exciting photo of him on there. He looks kind of like Jim Carrey. He's real intense looking. Yeah, that photo right there. We'll have to work on looking at photos. Okay. South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun was so sick that he had missed 4 months of debate over whether California should enter the Union as a free state. On March 4th of 1850, Calhoun, explaining that he was too ill to deliver a prepared speech, asked Senator James M. Mason of Virginia to deliver it for him. This is a personal voice from John C. Calhoun. I have, senators, believed from the first that the agitation of the subject of slavery would, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end in disunion. The agitation has been permitted to proceed until it has reached a period when it can no longer be disguised or denied that the Union is in danger. You have thus had forced upon you the greatest and gravest question that can ever come under your consideration. How can the Union be preserved? So Calhoun is basically predicting the Civil War right there, and this is in 1850. This is 11 years before the war gets underway, and he's calling it out. He's much, kind of like a person trying to keep a relationship together, to put it in terms that you young people can understand. All right. Senator Calhoun called on the North to give the South justice, simple justice. He demanded that slavery be allowed throughout the territories won in the war with Mexico. If it was not, he declared, the South would secede or withdraw from the Union. Once again, the issue of slavery had brought about a political crisis, deepening the gulf between the North and the South. Okay, some exciting stuff's happened here since you went away for Christmas break. There was a war with Mexico, which apparently the United States won. Porque nosotros no hablamos español. What else? And California has been admitted to the Union. So, oh my gosh, there were some of those birds back there. Anyhow, back to this. Differences between the North and the South. That's the heading in the next paragraph. And as you might guess, those paragraphs will probably tell you what some of the differences are. Senator Calhoun argued that although the North and South had been politically equal when the Constitution was adopted, the perfect equilibrium between the two sections no longer existed. At any rate, the two sections certainly had developed different ways of life by the 1850s. Industry and immigration in the North. The North industrialized rapidly as factories turned out ever-increasing amounts of products, from textiles and sewing machines to farm equipment and guns. Railroads with more than 20,000 miles of track laid during the 1850s carried raw materials eastward and manufactured goods and settlers westward. Small towns like Chicago matured into cities almost overnight due to the sheer volume of goods and people arriving by railroad. Telegraph wires strung along the railroad tracks provided a network of instant communication for the North. Immigrants from Europe entered the industrial workplace in growing numbers. Many became voters with a strong opposition to slavery. They feared the expansion of slavery for two main reasons. First, it might bring slave labor into direct competition with free labor, or people who worked for wages. Second, it threatened to reduce the status of white workers who could not successfully compete with slaves. Okay, agriculture and slavery in the South. Unlike the North, the South remained a predominantly rural society, consisting mostly of plantations and small farms. The Southern economy relied on staple crops such as cotton. Though one-third of the nation's population lived in the South in 1850, the South produced under 10% of the nation's manufactured goods. At the same time that the northern railroad lines were expanding, Southerners were mostly using rivers to transport goods. In addition, few immigrants settled in the South because African Americans, whether enslaved or free, met most of the available need for artisans, mechanics, and laborers. Those immigrants who did settle in the South, however, displayed significant opposition to slavery. For example, German-American newspapers in Texas and in Baltimore, Maryland, published editorials in favor of universal voting rights and freedom for African Americans. The conflict over slavery rattled Southern society. In 3 Southern states, Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina, African Americans were in majority. In Alabama and Florida, African Americans composed almost half of the population. While blacks dreamed of an end to slavery, many Southern whites feared that any restriction of slavery would lead to a social and economic revolution. Furthermore, Calhoun warned that such a revolution would condemn blacks as well as whites to the greatest calamity and the South to poverty, desolation, and wretchedness. Moving ahead, let's go to page 306. On August 8th of 1846, this paragraph talks about slavery in the territories. And this is why slavery was divisive, was because as these new territories were added, the issue came up of whether they should have slavery or not have slavery. So, therefore, it became a problem. On August 8th, 1846, Pennsylvania Democrat David Wilmot heightened tensions between North and South by introducing an amendment to a military appropriations bill proposing that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any territory the United States might acquire as a result of the war with Mexico. In strictly practical terms, the Wilmot Proviso meant that California, as well as the territories of Utah and New Mexico, would be closed to slavery forever. The Wilmot Proviso divided Congress along regional lines. Northerners, angry over the refusal of Southern congressmen to vote for internal improvements, such as the building of canals and roads, supported the proviso. They also feared that adding slave territory would give slave states more members in Congress and deny economic opportunity to free workers. Southerners, as expected, opposed the proviso, which some argued raised complex constitutional issues. Slaves were property, Southerners claimed, and property was protected by the Constitution. Laws like the Wilmot Proviso would undermine such constitutional protections. Many Southerners feared that if the Wilmot Proviso became law, the inevitable addition of new free states to the Union would shift the balance of power permanently to the North. The House of Representatives approved the Proviso, but the Senate rejected it. Congressman Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia issued a dire prediction. This is Alexander H. Stephens talking here. The North is going to stick the Wilmot Amendment to every appropriation, and then all the South will vote against any measure thus clogged. Finally, a tremendous struggle will take place, and perhaps President Polk, in starting one war, may find half a dozen on his hands. I tell you, the prospect ahead is dark, cloudy, thick, and gloomy. Pretty eloquent guy. I mean, he should have written some books. It's pretty amazing. All right, statehood for California. As a result of the gold rush, California had grown in population so quickly that it skipped the territorial phase of becoming a state. Normally, it took a while for states to become states. Normally, a land was acquired, and then it became a territory, and then it became a state. One of the requisites or things that caused that was the number of people that moved in. They had to get so many people moved in. In many cases, in the Western territories, they didn't have to own property, but they did have to register, and they had to follow some guidelines. California filled up with people so quickly because of the gold rush. There are stories where there were waiters in like places like New York and stuff, and they would just drop what they were doing and split for the gold rush. And so thousands upon thousands of people flooded into California looking for gold. All right. California's new constitution forbade slavery, a fact that alarmed many Southerners. They had assumed that because most of California lay south of the Missouri Compromise line of 3630, the state would be open to slavery. They had hoped that the compromise struck in 1820 would apply to new territories, including California, which would have become a slave state. General Zachary Taylor, who succeeded Polk as president in 1849, supported California's admission as a free state. Moreover, he felt that the South could counter abolitionism most effectively by leaving the slavery issue up to the individual territories rather than a Congress. Southerners, however, saw this as a move to block slavery in the territories and as an attack on the Southern way of life, and began to question whether the South should remain in the Union. So again, what the book is trying to tell you here, what these authors are trying to tell you is several things. Congress is getting tired of trying to solve this problem all the time. So they, along with the president, start to pass the buck. They create something called popular sovereignty, which we'll read about here shortly, which is where they allow the people to decide on a decision instead of them voting on it. And it basically puts the responsibility of voting back in the hands of the people. It's kind of like a Jacksonian democracy sort of thing. The second thing is that they're hinting that the idea of going to war is getting stronger. Moving ahead to page 307. Oh my goodness, it's time for our first commercial break. I forgot. This special reading episode is sponsored by Kroger black beans, sometimes known as frijoles negros. These things are delicious. They're really an easy thing to cook. You just throw them in a pan with like a little bit of olive oil and some finely chopped onions, maybe some paprika. If you got an habanero pepper, that makes them really good. And I like cilantro with mine, and you just cook them kind of slow. They're really great with rice, chicken, meat, even fish. So yeah, Kroger black beans, delicious. They're also a good source of iron. Did you know that? Iron. Ask your chemistry teacher. Moving ahead, the Senate debates. We're on page 307. Try to stay with me here. The 31st Congress opened in December of 1849, in an atmosphere of distrust and bitterness. How exciting. The question of California statehood topped the agenda. Of equal concern was the border dispute in which the slave state of Texas claimed the eastern half of New Mexico territory, where the issue of slavery had not yet been settled. In the meantime, Northerners demanded the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, while Southerners accused the North of failing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. So the North is trying to get the District of Columbia, which is where the D.C. part of Washington comes from, Washington, D.C. They're trying to get that to be free of slavery. Technically, D.C. is in Virginia, so this is going to irritate the South. And Southerners are upset because the North is not enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 is obviously not a nice law. What it did was it allowed southern bounty hunters and northern bounty hunters, for that matter, to go find any person, any black person that they believed to be an escaped slave who had left the South legally or otherwise, and drag them back to be returned to the South. In the eyes of the Southerners, the slave was property, and constitutionally you cannot be deprived of property. In the eyes of many Northern abolitionists, the slave was a human being, and so these two concepts kind of clash. Where were we? As passions rose, some Southerners threatened secession, the formal withdrawal of a state from the Union. You see how the book tells you what a word means as you're reading along? It's a good idea sometimes to write these words down, the ones in bold, that's like the real dark stuff, and then you can actually define them as you're going. And it makes it really easy if you just read, put down your cell phone, take off the headphones, and read. You can learn a few things. It's pretty amazing. Finally, could anything be done to prevent the United States from becoming two nations? Two. Let's call that cliffhanger sentence. It's actually pretty good writing on the part of our authors. Usually history textbooks are pretty boring, but here they're leading to suspense. I mean, that's pretty good, really, if you think about it. All right, Clay's compromise. Henry Clay worked night and day to shape a compromise that both the North and the South could accept. Though ill, he visited his old rival Daniel Webster on January 21st of 1850 and obtained Webster's support. 8 days later, Clay presented to the Senate a series of resolutions later called the Compromise of 1850, which he hoped would settle all questions and controversy between the free and slave states growing out of the subject of slavery. Check us out, okay? Henry Clay is ill, and so is John C. Calhoun. It's kind of strange. They're both sick. Henry Clay is from Kentucky. He was a very hard-working congressman. He's definitely kind of an American hero. The guy would have been handy, actually, in present day with our fiscal cliff negotiations, because he was good at coming up with solutions. He liked to get things done. So Clay comes up with this compromise. Clay's compromise and the compromise of 1850, they are the same thing. It's the same, okay? The terms of the compromise. This next paragraph is going to tell you what Clay comes up with. All right, Clay's compromise summarized on the chart shown on page 308. So later when your teacher, whoever that might be, asks you to look up stuff about this and tell you what were the terms of Clay's compromise, just go to the chart and look. It's right there. It's even in color. You've got purple, you've got red, and you've got green. All right, back to Clay's compromise. To satisfy the North, the compromise provided that California be admitted to the Union as a free state. To satisfy the South, the compromise proposed a new and more effective fugitive slave law. Other provisions of the compromise had elements that appealed to both regions. For example, a provision that allowed residents of the territories of New Mexico and Utah popular sovereignty, the right of residents of a territory to vote for or against slavery, appealed to both North and South. As part of the compromise, the federal government would pay Texas $10 million to surrender its claim to New Mexico. Northerners were pleased because, in effect, it limited slavery in Texas to within its current borders. Southerners were pleased because the money would help defray Texas' expense and debts from the war with Mexico. All right, moving to the next page, 308. On February 5th, Clay defended his resolutions and begged the North and South to consider them thoughtfully. The alternative was disunion, and in Clay's opinion, quite possibly war. That would be the Civil War, like Clay was predicting that it would happen. A personal voice from Henry Clay. In such a war as it would be following the dissolution of the Union, sir, we may search the pages of history, and none so ferocious, so bloody, so implacable, so exterminating, would rage with such violence. I implore, gentlemen, I adjure them, whether from the South or the North, to pause at the edge of the precipice before the fearful and dangerous leap be taken into the yawning abyss below. See what I mean? This guy could speak. I mean, that's like poetry. Calhoun and Webster respond. Clay's speech marked the start of one of the greatest political debates in the United States history. Within a month, Calhoun had presented the Southern case for slavery in the territories. He was followed 3 days later by Daniel Webster, who began his eloquent appeal for national unity by saying, I wish to speak today, not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. That kind of rhymes. That's pretty cool. The guy should have rapped. Hear me for my cause. He urged Northerners to try to compromise with the South by passing a stricter fugitive slave law, and he warned that Southern firebrands to think more cautiously about the danger of secession. This is a personal voice by Daniel Webster. I hear with pain and anguish and distress the word secession, especially when it falls from the lips of those who are eminently patriotic. Secession, peaceable secession. There can be no such thing as peaceable secession. Is the great Constitution under which we live to be thought melted away by secession? No, sir. I will not state what might produce the disruption of the states. What that disruption must produce would be such a war as I will not describe. Webster's speech became one of the most famous in the history of the Senate. The packed Senate chamber was stunned to see longtime foes Clay and Webster finally, and for the last time. The Senate rejected the proposed compromise in July. Discouraged, Clay left Washington. Stephen Douglas of Illinois picked up the pro-compromise reins. We'll be hearing more about the Stephen Douglas guy later. He's right there in your book, and that little skinny little thing. He did a lot of debating with some guy named Lincoln. They debated a lot, and the debates are kind of a big deal in the state of Illinois. To avoid another defeat, Douglas developed a shrewd plan. He unbundled the package of resolutions and reintroduced one at a time, hoping to obtain a majority vote for each measure individually. Thus, any individual congressman could vote for the provisions that he liked and vote against or abstain from voting on those that he disliked. It appeared as though Douglas had found the key to passing the entire compromise. The unexpected death of President Taylor on July 9th aided Douglas's efforts. Taylor's successor, Millard Fillmore, made it clear that he supported the compromise. In the meantime, the South was ready to negotiate. Calhoun's death had removed one obstacle to compromise. Southern leaders came out in favor of Clay's individual proposals as being the best the South could secure without radical action. After 8 months of effort, the Compromise of 1850 was voted into law. President Fillmore embraced the compromise as the final settlement of the question of slavery and sectional differences. For the moment, the crisis over slavery in the territories had passed. However, the relief was short-lived. Even as crowds in Washington celebrated the passage of the compromise, the next crisis loomed ominously on the horizon: enforcement of the fugitive slave law. Okay, just a quick explanation here. When a congressman or a representative, when they get elected, they represent thousands of people. And so those thousands of people from the state want them to do lots of things. So they can't make a law for every single thing. And what they do often is group the things that they have to do together, the actions that they're taking in the names of their state together. They bundle them. So with this compromise, there were a lot of other issues attached to it. And what Stephen Douglas did was he broke this down. He understood something that a lot of high school teachers understand, which is people don't like to read. They don't have the attention span to read through very many things. So he separated it. He put it out one at a time so that the other congressmen could see it. And this is a pretty slick idea. Another thing that's kind of funny in here is that President Fillmore refers to this as being the final settlement to the question of slavery. And presidents are good at doing that. They're good at saying, that the problem is going away, when in reality it has not. All right, that is the end of our first reading session. I'd like to thank you for listening. It's been swell, and we will see you again real soon. And I've seen too much.